you another question. I was watching some of Krystal and Saagar's coverage on Breaking Points this morning, and at one point they compared this invasion of Ukraine to America's invasion of Iraq, saying there's no justification for Putin's actions. How would you respond to such a comparison in light of the context you've just laid out for us?
Well, first of all, I actually find the comparison offensive, to be honest. I love Saagar and Krystal, but so it's not like they're the only ones making it. I find it offensive because I think it minimizes what a moral atrocity the invasion of Iraq was. The United States did not invade a bordering country that was the venue for all kinds of shenanigans and interference on the part of their longstanding greatest rival. The United States packed up a military of hundreds of thousands of troops and went all the way to the other side of the world and invaded a country that in no way was ever a threat to the United States. No one even pretended or argued that, other than through what we all now know was the fraud of Iraqi WMDs. And even if Iraq had a WMD program, the idea that that would have been a threat, a direct threat to the United States, was itself a lie. So there was zero plausible reason to view Iraq as a threat to the United States, a country all the way on the other side of the world that had a military, a tiny fraction of what the United States was, that had never shown any interest or propensity to attack the United States. What you have here is a completely different situation. Aside from the idea of NATO expansion, which we just talked about, we have to remember that the United States has been basically the colonial masters of Ukraine since at least 2014, when, you want to call it a revolution, some people call it a coup, whatever you want to call it, there was a change of government from a government that was more or less neutral or leaning toward Moscow to one that was very pro-EU. And, we all know about the scandal, the ethical scandal involving Hunter Biden, but it's worth revisiting because it sheds light on the reality of the situation, which was, why did Burisma think it was worth it to pay Hunter Biden $50,000 a month, $600,000 a year to sit on the board of that company, despite the fact that he had zero competence in or knowledge of any energy industry, let alone Ukrainian energy? It was because his dad at the time was basically like the consul, like the colonial overseer of Ukraine. Like part of Joe Biden's portfolio as vice president under the Obama administration was to rule Ukraine. There was a phone call between Victoria Nuland, the then U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, that leaked, in which they were plotting which president they thought was best and that they wanted to install. Biden was literally micromanaging Ukrainian governance. He was picking and choosing which prosecutors needed to be fired and which ones needed to be hired. The U.S. was actively involved in taking Ukraine and turning it into like a vassal state of the United States, right on not just the Russian border, but the most sensitive region of the Russian border, which was the launching ground for two different cataclysmic wars that were from attacks by Germany twice in the 20th century that led to the deaths of tens of millions of Russians through Ukraine, the most sensitive spot for Russia. So it's not just this NATO expansion encircling Russia or the threat of putting Ukraine in NATO. It's also what the United States was actually doing in Ukraine, changing its government, micromanaging all of its resources, very close to the Russian border, that again made very patriotic and, respected members of the U.S. security state aware that what we were doing in Ukraine was a grave threat, an actual direct threat, not just a perceived one, but a direct threat to Russia in a way that nobody could ever claim was the case for Iraq. Now, that doesn't mean that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is justified. I mean, you can still say they were both unjustified. So I guess in that sense, like, you could compare them if you just like create a broad category of unjustified attacks and throw both Ukraine and Iraq into it. Okay, that's fine. But the comparison ends there because no one reasonable can contest the fact that Russia has a much stronger case why their national security was imperiled by what was happening in Ukraine than the U.S. did vis-a-vis Iraq in 2003.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that, I've heard a lot of people they're trying to make the case that, this isn't actually about NATO expansion. This is,
Putin, that ship sailed when Putin, did the full scale invasion of Ukraine. Basically trying to, portray it as, I believe the comparison you made in your Rumble stream was Czechoslovakia, Hitler. Like once, if he takes this area, then the whole world is like his new, pie for him to, expand his reach. And, I don't know, very dramatic, authoritarian interpretation of, what he's stated as is more likely to be the NATO expansion. I just am wondering if what you would say to somebody that's said, oh, if it was about NATO expansion, he wouldn't have continued had Ukraine, like now that Ukraine is saying basically, President Zelensky was like, oh, we don't even want to bother joining NATO. And this was maybe a week and a half ago. They went ahead with the invasion anyway. They still recognize the two territories. Do you think there's any truth to that argument? And mostly I'm curious about how you would dispel that in real time.
Well, first of all, I think we need to ask the question, given how cataclysmic this war is and how menacing it's being depicted, as like the worst invasion by a foreign power of another power since the end of World War II. Not really sure how we decided to skip over Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and all the other wars that have happened since then, but let's indulge this narrative. If that's really true, you would think the United States would have done everything within its power to avert this war. That's, reasonable to do. So generally, when a country is threatening war against another country, they make their grievances very clear. Like before Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, we didn't get to hear about it in the United States, but they made their grievances clear. They said, you have troops on sacred Saudi Arabia soil. Your sanctions regime against Iraq killed 500,000 children. You support Israel as they slaughter Palestinians or oppress Palestinians. And that's why we're angry at you. That's why we want to attack you. Countries state what their actual grievance is. And Putin was very clear, very clear. You go read articles from even a month ago where major Western outlets were stating very, as though it were not even questioned, that the main grievance of Putin when it came to Ukraine was the threat of putting Ukraine in NATO. And the demand that the Russians were making was a very simple one, which is that both the United States / NATO and Ukraine agree, state formally, that they will no longer do that. And there were a lot of people, Tulsi Gabbard and a lot of other people, saying we should be doing a lot more to avert war than we're doing. And one of the things we should be doing is sitting down with the Russians and agreeing that we will neutralize the Ukraine, that they will never not be pro-Moscow nor pro-Western Europe or pro-NATO. They will just be a neutral country that has allegiances to neither. And we can give the Russians what they're asking, since nobody thinks it's realistic or wise to put Ukraine in NATO. We could just say to them, okay, we agree. It's too threatening to you, legitimately so, for Ukraine to be in NATO. So we agree with you that will not happen. And instead, the Biden administration refused to give that assurance. And they cited this principle that NATO has an open door. We can put whoever we want in NATO. Okay, well, if that principle is really so important that we can put anybody into an alliance that, by the way, the purpose of which is gone. The purpose of NATO was to prevent the Soviet Union from importing communist ideology and invading Western Europe. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. And Russia exists, but not as a communist superpower. So there's a question of why does NATO even exist, let alone why is this principle that Blinken is citing to reject Russian demands so sacrosanct that we're going to put anybody we want, including Ukraine, into this military alliance. But if you're somebody who believes that this war is so cataclysmic, that it's like Hitler, that it's the worst thing that's happened since, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, that it's going to be the thing that undoes the entire international rule-based order, whatever you think about it, you should be really angry, I think, with the United States for not having done more to try and reach a solution. Now, you might say, oh, it was just a pretext. Putin didn't really care about NATO. Even if we had given him that, he still would have invaded Ukraine. Maybe. We'll never know, that counterfactual. But I still don't understand why you wouldn't want the United States to do everything it could to diplomatically avert what is clearly a cataclysmic war. As for the claim that, well, now there's a full-scale invasion, so it proves that Putin's concern wasn't really NATO, I don't really understand how one follows from the other, in part because I don't think it's clear yet that conquest of Ukraine, all of Ukraine, is actually the Russian goal, even though they're bombing places outside of those two territories. There are military reasons why you might do that, even if your ultimate goal is still just the emancipation of those two territories. But even if they do end up occupying Ukraine and conquering Ukraine and doing regime change in Ukraine, how does that prove that the alleged fear that Putin had or the threat he perceived from NATO expansion wasn't real? And again, nobody in Western capitals for the last 15 years denied that that was a genuine fear. Of course, it's a genuine fear if you're the Russians. And what I found so notable about what William Burns said, the current CIA director, in the letter that he wrote to Condoleezza Rice in 2008 was he had gone to Russia and spent many months there. And what he said was, the thing that really impressed me was the idea that NATO expansion into Ukraine is a grave threat to Russia isn't something reserved or confined just to Putin or to his hardline advisors. You hear it from what he called the knuckle draggers and the deep recesses of the Kremlin, but he also said you hear it from the most thoughtful and enlightened liberal opponents of Putin. Basically, all Russians agreed that that is a serious and grave national security threat to Russia that Russia shouldn't tolerate. This is not a view that Putin as a madman concocted. And so, again, we'll never know for sure what would have happened had the US and NATO simply given and the Ukrainians simply given the Russians what they were demanding. But there's no reason to think that that wouldn't have helped. And at the very least, why shouldn't we have tried that?